Welcome everybody. Firstly, an apology. I was, like most of the times when we're asked to put a title of a presentation together, we do it on the fly like I did on a train, and then I looked at what I was presenting last week and realised I'd missed the word asset management. So some of you may have been thinking, what a facilities management information system is quite broad, whereas actually I want to focus on asset condition, capital planning, funding, prioritisation. So to introduce Accruent, we are a software company, a global software company, focused very much on the end-to-end life cycle of real estate facilities. We look at ourselves working along a timeline of shape, drive, manage and control. And we look at that very much from the long-term view right down to the second. So in terms of shape, what we're going to be focused on today is very much about that long-term capital planning. Very much could be 1, 2, 3, 5 years, but obviously PFIs going up to 30-year concessions, that kind of forward planning through to delivering software solutions for executing on some of those strategies like project management, for example, bringing collaboration into your project teams, dealing with scheduling, dealing with financial control, right through to actually keeping the organisation running, that facilities management piece. We've got a lot of we're very, very strong in retail in the UK. We've got a lot of our customers here today like Co-op and Tesco, Travis Perkins, John Lewis Partnership, for example, using our CAFM solution, VX Maintain, right through to control. And this is very much down to the second. It's mobile workforce management. So it's actually deploying engineers out in the field, scheduling those engineers, dispatch optimization of their time, down to industrial IoT as well. So this is very much about remote monitoring. We were at the event in Celtic Manor earlier in the year, and we did a presentation around the industrial IoT piece and very much the future of CAFM systems. Today I want to bring it right back to the front end, which is very much about that shape business part about it. Where are you going to get your funding from? How can you justify that funding? How are you actually going to prioritize what you spend your money on? So in terms of today's agenda, very much around managing facility assets, talk a little bit about some of the budgeting challenges that a lot of our customers have seen, a disciplined, effective approach to funding, a disciplined, effective approach for project prioritization, look a bit about the results of those, and then we'll go into Q&A. In terms of the methodologies I'm going to be talking about today, I mean, these aren't unique to Accruent. These have been out there for many years. It's just that what we found is a lot of the customers that we taught haven't actually deployed these. So it's an alternative approach, shall we say. Some of you may already be using them, but this presentation leads very nicely into a round table that I'll be running afterwards. So I'd really, really appreciate anyone to join that as well and just talk about different challenges in the market or maybe different methodologies that you're using so we can sort of brainstorm those ideas. So many of you or many of your colleagues have that daunting task of trying to every year get your budget together for those capital plans and actually support the organisation, spend that money in a way not only so that it's ready for today's facilities but also for the years to come. It needs, many of us are faced with attracting high quality employees, or if you're a university, retaining those student levels. You know that many people these days are very much enjoy where they're working, and facilities play an important part of that. Providing the required infrastructure, proactively deferring that maintenance, deferred maintenance backlog that most people have, and also keep within the available funding that you're given. Or alternatively, how do you actually put that business plan together for more funding? So in terms of an alternative approach to meeting funding needs, before I talk about that, there's one thing I'd like to talk about is an alternative approach to measuring facilities condition. Now, how many of you are using something called the Facility Condition Index? Does that ring a bell for anyone? No. It's been around for many years, and ultimately what it does is a formula. So it's a benchmark of taking the total cost of your existing deficiencies, let's say against an asset, an air conditioning unit, for example, and divide that by the current replacement value. So for example, let's say, for example, you had a group of systems worth £100,000 and there was a capital needs of £10,000, it would have a 10% FCI, which would sit in this range here between good and fair. So, you're not doing too badly at a 10% FCI. The consolidation of all of those systems can, give you a good view of that building, so a consolidated view. Now, obviously, it depends on the type of portfolio you're running. If you're managing a hospital, for example, and you're trending up in this north corner around the sort of 40-50%, you're potentially going to have a major effect on life safety, which isn't going to be acceptable. If you're talking about a car park or storage in the back of the building, that may be a little bit more acceptable. You're probably going to want to be between this sort of 0 and 5%. So clearly, we've been very much used to the sort of traditional A, B, C, D rules, and you can marry the FCI up to those particular classifications. When you're looking at a PFI and you're looking like at a 30-year concession with a hand back in 30 years' time, for example, often the requirements are for that facility to be handed back in condition B. Well, the question is, what is condition B? You're managing the investment and the funding of that. If you hand it back in condition A, you're not going to win any prizes for over-investing. And similarly, if it's handed back in C, D, obviously there's going to be penalties and some challenges there as well. So this gives you a much more prescriptive approach, a much more targeted approach to actually get it right. What that means is, this is an example of a university like this, for example. This is one of our US customers, universities. And once they've grouped all that information, you can get a very, very clear pattern of the estate. This could obviously be at a national level, if you're a retailer, for example. But this is a good example where the FCI can bring some of that good intel. So in terms of funding outputs, once you've got that facility condition index, it allows you to do a number of things. Firstly, you can slice and dice the portfolio to actually track how the FCI is performing on your portfolio. I've brought a couple of examples here from our solution VFA facility. I've just run a scenario plan against the whole portfolio in this case. Got funding levels on the left-hand side, and this is the FCI on the right-hand side. Often the FCI is also given as a denominator of 1. So in this case, you can see that over a 10-year scenario, we're running at about sort of 33%. So not really a great position to be in. But what you can start to do, and also you can see someone's got a big spike to deal with in 2021. So a lot of this data is coming from life cycle data based on the facility. So obviously an installation date, an end date, and you've got the life cycle, which is feeding into these funding. So 33%, not a great position to be in. So we might have our annual budget, or we may be looking at our long-term planning, and we may be told that we're being given, let's say, £15 million a year over 10 years. And I've just run this as a straight 15 million with inflation. So you can see the light blue graphs here. And it's telling us a story here. So we were running at 33%, and now we can see a deterioration in the FCI north of that to sort of 37%, something like that. So immediately we're given a credible story to say, well, okay, you've given us this pot of money, it's not enough. Alternatively, well, you might be asked, well, what sort of money do we need? And we've got, we can then run various scenarios on that instead. So here, for example, we've run just north of 20 million a year. Again, this can be on a year-by-year basis, up to 2028. It's telling a very different story. It's handling that spike there in 2021, and then we're seeing an improvement down to just between sort of 23%, something like that. So we now know what sort of funding levels we need, and we're obviously going to want to map those out on a year-by-year basis, but this is just really an example of that. Again, in defending that budget, we can also say, well, actually, what do we need to do to maybe get to a 15% FCI? And we want to do that within 7 years. So we can run a different scenario on this in the FCI. and you can see where the red bars have come in. So we're going to need more funding. Obviously, we're trying to improve the estate here. So this is actually, we can see larger pots of money through here until we achieve that FCI, and then you're actually going to see that you're not trying to fix the squeaky wheel. You're spending more on planned preventative maintenance instead of those emergency repairs, and we're seeing a decrease in that. And these scenarios, excuse me, I've run this across the whole portfolio, or I've run this across a region, but you can actually break the portfolio down in a uni format and apply, as I mentioned, FCI to different systems. So you can say, right, what are our roofing funding needs over the next 1 year, 5 years, 20 years, whatever they may be. And again, we can start to plan in a much informative way. So actually, when we get the outputs, we can start to run these, and we can see a year-by-year basis, the replacement cost. We can see the backlog deterioration reducing, and we can see those funding levels, and also the reduction in the FCI as well. So that's really the way that we use the FCI. As I mentioned before, I wasn't surprised not to see many people put your hands up. I'd have been quite worried if everyone had put their hands up. It's always nice to talk about something new. But actually, it's a very, very prescriptive way of doing that. The next thing I'd like to talk about is an alternative approach to capital planning prioritization. So you've been through the funding modelling. You've got a good idea of how much money you need. How do you actually spend that money? And what typically, in terms of prioritization, involves multiple factors. So you've got, for example, when does this project need to be done? Is this a critical project for the organisation? It's within the next couple of months? Is it 1 to 2 years, or is it a long-term project plan that we need to put together? What is the impact on customer retention, or what is the impact on our students or other staff, for example, or our staff? These are all different scenarios that you're going to have to plan out. How do we use the asset, if it's an asset project, for example? Is it a customer facing? Is it something maybe in a retail store that's core to the use, or is it back office, or in the back of the store, for example? Is this a compliance project? Is it going to affect life safety? Is it an energy project, or is it functional, or is it just to do with end of life, for example? And other things is this an important system associated with the project? i.e., is failure of this going to have a major impact on maybe a store closing down for that first week in December, for example? And what is the condition of the asset? This might just simply be excellent down to poor. So you bring all these factors in, and somebody's job in your organisation is to actually weigh up all these factors and then apply this to the funding method. So what we do is you break down these major major categories, things like timing, the asset condition, for example, and they all need to be cross-referenced against each other to get a good idea of that project plan. And the thing about this is every single project you deal with is completely different, so you need to run this every single time. So a methodology that we recommend is something called Pairwise Comparison Analysis, and I'm sure some of you may have heard of this one. And this is kind of like a way of comparing or splitting decisions up into pairs. It's like a divide and conquer. So if, for example, I just picked out 3 of those, keep it simple, say reason, the asset use, and also the customer impact, we would actually just compare the 3 of these before we go into the values that sit between those. So in this case, for example, you would add a score based on where the weighting is. Is it nearer the reason end? Is reason more important to asset use? So, for example, if reason is, and you can bring in whatever scoring you want. In this example, if reason is very important versus the asset use, you might give it a score of 5, for example. If reason is somewhat important, you might give it a 4. If reason and asset use have equal weighting, they'd have a 3. And likewise, if it's trending towards the other option, asset use, 2 down to 1, for example. So in this example, reason's got a weighting of 5 there and just a 1 there. So reason holds a weighting of around 5, for example. You can see customer impact, however, it's got a larger sway against reason, and also in that it's in the halfway point between asset use and customer impact, actually. So if you were to bring out the factors or the categories in total, you can see that customer impact would lead that. We then need to actually bring down the subset of values within life safety, for example. So, reason. And you can see we're measuring life safety, energy, functionality, end of life. So we need to do the same methodology and apply that to that category as well. So life safety will be measured against energy, then against functionality, then end of life, then energy will be mentioned against functionality, end of life, etc. And again, we need to repeat that process as well. So this is actually giving you a very sort of mathematical approach to doing this. Now, obviously, depending on the size or the number of projects you're running, that can be quite cumbersome if you're using spreadsheets, for example. So we'd always recommend using software to actually automate the process and eliminate some of those manual calculations. So by doing this, it makes choosing factors to be used, you can build your templates up. And actually what you're doing is every time you're selecting one of these templates, you're building a strategy. So you'd have your different organizational strategies. It could be an energy sustainability strategy, for example. It could be business improvement. It could be very much a financially led strategy. But again, you can pick these in a software solution, much easier to do than capturing manually. And so you can start to run these what-if scenarios. You can build in very sort of rapid, non-demand iterations of budget scenarios. I mentioned about the strategies. Here's one, for example, that we set up, which has the category. It's then measuring the FCI, and then the priority, and then the use in order. And you see, we have our software tool that I was talking about earlier, VFA Facility. It simply breaks these down into sliders as well. And there's a lot of flexibility in what you want to bring into your strategies. And so you're simply coming along, maybe starting from new or picking an existing template and sliding the weightings so that actually, you can see how these are interacting. The main thing about doing it in this approach is it actually, when you start to see a visualization of where your weightings are on these categories versus the values in there, it does facilitate those conversations at a very early stage, rather than having to reshuffle projects at a later date, maybe when you're going for approval. By doing it this way, it does allow you to get everyone around the table and talk about, where do these weightings sit. Now, we sit in as a consultants on a lot of these conversations at the beginning, and they can, obviously everyone's kind of got their own projects in mind, and it usually very, very healthy debate. But again, once you've got to that, gone through that process and actually using a tool like this, it does mean that you can actually say, well, we all agreed on this last year or 6 months ago, whatever, and these are the results. So typically, by applying a strategy, you can actually come through, apply that strategy, and we're talking usually in these kind of projects are usually in that sort of 1, 2, 3 year term. So you'd say, well, okay, we've got funding of say 12 million in this year, 9 million next year. You run the different budgetary amounts that you think are going to be specific to this. It will then give you a deficit. So if, for example, it's going to run through and it's going to pull out all of those particular priority projects, and then if there's a deficit to the next one, it'll put it down there, and then you can choose how to allocate that. So when you actually get the results, you'll see the score here on the top left-hand corner. We've scored 87 here. So this is the largest project. It's a life safety project. It's something that's kind of absolutely key to the organisation based on the mission. It gives you the estimated cost, etc., etc. And then obviously you can, if for example sitting on the top of the list is refurbishment of the managing director's office, you might say, well, we've actually got bigger priorities than that. For example, when we ran this scenario in one financial institution we were talking to a few years ago, we're also an assessment business as well, which is quite rare for a software business. So we actually have assessors that go out and capture this data as well. And for example, we've got assessors at Thames Water at the moment. And when we were capturing data for a financial institution, we ran this scenario. Their biggest next investment was going to be the refurbishment of the toilets. And actually, when we actually looked at it closely, the generator that was actually powering the trading floor was near end of life. And so you can imagine the scenario if that had gone versus the toilets, for example. So again, pairwise analysis allows you to translate the comparisons into points using formulas. It can create you a list, it gives you a ranking, and you can repeat this process for every budget period. So it's going to give you that prioritized budget plan. As mentioned, key stakeholders are going to be involved from the beginning. Complex decisions are reduced to a series of very simple comparisons. Weights and values are applied to the data attributes, and one of the key things, it does depoliticize that fund allocation as well. Going back to the beginning, one of our customers, NHS Scotland, they very much 3 years ago, when it came to funding allocation, it really was like a lot of organisations. It was who had the most political clout or political influence or shouted the loudest was whether the funding was going to go to the paediatric wing in Dunfermline versus A&E in Glasgow, for example. And so, not very strategic approach for fund allocation, which was having to be done on an annual basis. And so, when we met them 3 years ago, they started implementing this process. Now, they've got a very nice centralised healthcare system in Scotland, with 14 Scottish health boards. And now, those Scottish health boards, when they're putting their budgetary plans together, use VFA facility for all that prioritising. So the money's actually going based on where those strategic objectives have been placed. They're now in a position with a centralised asset lifecycle system. The capital spend is obviously aligned with the mission, very much focused on life safety and improved patient care. Facilities are getting better. I don't know how I'm doing for time, but I've got 10 minutes. Okay, we've got a lot of Q&A there. So, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't sort of introduce a little bit more about the system I just talked about. I mean, obviously having a capital planning solution system, most of our customers have come from spreadsheets. Spreadsheets are great. We all use them. They're flexible. But when you start putting monetary values through a spreadsheet, you really do start to see some challenges. For example, if you've inherited that spreadsheet from somebody else, how can you validate the formulas in there? If there's one little error at a decimal point, those numbers are going to consolidate through all the worksheets. So typically having a structured approach to it does eliminate some of those errors. You can start to build in fewer emergency premiums because you're actually spending it in the right way rather than having to go on a fix. Smart procurement as well. Once you've got that visibility into, for example, if you remember on that funding graph, that big spike coming in 2028, we know we're going to have a lot of spend that year. Maybe that spend also involves putting scaffolding up on the side of the building. We can actually start to get some visibility into where else there is, for example, spend that we need to spend on the north end of the building. Or it could be that we've got a global portfolio and we're looking at actually consolidating our air conditioning unit vendor, for example. We've seen savings up to sort of 15% on that. And also those emotionally driven priorities are taken out. So you include improving your customer or your student satisfaction, your targeting, your investments are aligned with the true needs of the organisation. You're getting full transparency and just a better data-driven process, and your more ability to respond to the changes and emergency and extra funding when you actually need those as well. So a very sort of short overview, but hopefully it was something that maybe we can either continue on in a round table or ask any questions now.